Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. I'm Reverend Matt and I'm the Connectionalist, and today we're going to be reacting to another video from Crash Course. We did that yesterday, and I love Crash Course, and I'm really going to love on this channel when theology and faith mixes with history, because history is like my other great love. And I almost studied and double majored in history in college and then just decided not to. I was on path for ministry, and so I just decided to focus in on that. But history is like most of what I read, and so I love it when our faith I love it when our faith and Christianity aligns with history topics, because we're going to explore that, and I'm going to be excited to explore that. So today we're going to be talking about we're going to be reacting to a video from Crash Course on the Crusades. The Crusades are a very controversial piece of Christian history, because they mostly didn't do anything lasting, and it was a lot of bad things that came out of it too. And so we're going to dive right in and explore that together. So let's get started.
Hi there, my name is John Green. This is Crash Course World History, and today we're going to talk about the Crusades. Oh, Stan, do we have to talk about the Crusades? I hate them. Here's the thing about the Crusades, which were a series of military expeditions from parts of...
It's funny, he's like I said, I hate them. I think it's interesting to like discuss for a minute like why the Crusades kind of begin, right? You have the emergence of the Islamic Empire in the 6th and 7th century, right? And Islam starts to take over most of North Africa, all of the Middle East, and into Asia Minor. And what's happening is Christendom is being surrounded in Europe by the Islamic Empire that's encroaching on them very quickly. And so there's like this almost they're like, we got to do something about it, right? And the response to what's happening ends up being worse than the thing that was happening to begin with, right? The Crusades were mostly failures and did a lot of really bad things at the same time. And also, they don't really align with the Christian message, and so I'm sure that's going to be talked about a bit.
Of Europe to the eastern coast of the Mediterranean. The real reason they feature so prominently in history is because we've endlessly romanticized the story of the Crusades. We've created this...
And look, we've romanticized it because it's kind of, like, cool, right? Like, if you skip past the, like, obvious evil that was going on, right? And I know that's a lot to ask. I'm just saying, like, the armor looks cool. It's like medieval. There's knights and shields and swords. It's like very aesthetically cool, I guess, which I think is what has led to the romanticism of what was a very dark period in our history.
A simple narrative with characters to root for and to root against, and it's been endlessly idealized by the likes of Sir Walter Scott, and there are knights with swords and lion hearts.
That's what I was just saying.
Stan, lion hearts. Thank you.
I love Crash Course. I love these videos.
Let's start by saying that initially the Crusades were not a holy war on the part of Europeans against Islam.
Yes, oh my gosh, that's an amazing start. That's true to a certain extent. I'm sure he's going to share more.
But in important ways, the Crusades were driven by religious faith.
Yes.
Mr. Green, religion causes all wars. Imagine no... I'm going to cut you off right there before you violate copyright me from the past, but as usual, you're wrong. Simple reading...
Yeah, let's let him finish.
Things of history are rarely sufficient. By the way, when did my handwriting get so much better? I mean, if the Crusades had been brought on by the lightning-fast rise of the Islamic Empire and a desire to keep in Christian hands the land of Jesus, then they would have started in the 8th century. But early Islamic dynasties like the Umayyads and the Abbasids were perfect.
Yeah, so I think this is a good point, right? Like I was talking about earlier about how like the rise of Islamic expansion is one of the factors, but there are multiple factors that go into play, right? It's too simple of a reading of history to be like, it's a holy war to retake Jerusalem, or it's just a self-defense thing, right? It's like multiple factors.
Perfectly happy with Christians and Jews living among them as long as they paid a tax.
Yeah,
and plus, the Christian pilgrimage business was awesome for the Islamic Empire's economy. But then a new group of Muslims, the Seljuk Turks, moved into the region, and they sacked the holy cities and made it much more difficult for Christians to make their pilgrimages. And while they quickly realized their mistake, it was already too late. The Byzantines, who'd had their literal asses kicked at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, felt the threat and called upon the West for...
So the Byzantines are the Eastern Roman Empire. After Rome falls in 476, the Byzantine Empire remains as the Roman Empire, and it really keeps its Roman identity to the very end. And its capital's in Constantinople, and it lasts until 1453. And by this time, in the 11th century, the Byzantine Empire is much smaller. It has waned in power from its height during Emperor Justinian in the 6th century. So it's waned from the height of its power, but it's still a very, very, very powerful force in the Middle East and in the Mediterranean.
For help. So the first official crusade began with a call to arms by Pope Urban II in 1095 CE.
Yep.
This was partly because Urban wanted to unite Europe, and he'd figured out the lesson the rest of us learned from alien invasion movies. The best way to get people to unite is to give them a common enemy.
Yeah.
So Urban called on all the bickering knights and nobility of Europe, and he saith unto his people, let us go forth and help the Byzantines, because then maybe they will acknowledge my awesomeness and get rid of their stupid not having me as Pope thing. And while...
Yeah, so this is an excellent reading of history, in my opinion. So basically, you have in the western part of Europe, because Rome fell and the Western Roman Empire falls in 476, the eastern parts of Europe, like in Greece and Asia Minor, where the Byzantines are very strong, you still have a central government, right, that's functioning decently. And in the West, the West devolves into feudalism, right? And so they're bickering knights, these bickering nobility, and these barons and kings of like 8,000 nation states. Not 8,000, but there's a lot of them. They're all just fighting with each other all the time. And Urban's like, I'm going to unite them by pointing at the Muslims and saying, we're going to go on a holy war. And maybe if I do that, and maybe if I go to the rescue of the Byzantine Empire, which is the Eastern Church at this time, because the Roman Church and the Eastern Church split in 1054. So 40 years prior, there was the formal split called the Great Schism. That's the first time the church actually has a governmental split. Is in 1054, 1056, something like that. It's in the 1050s. So 40 years later, Pope Urban's like, well, if we start a holy war and we go help the Byzantines, who are Eastern Orthodox now, maybe they'll become Roman Catholic again, and we can all be under the same Bishop of Rome, which is me, right? So there's a lot that goes into it.
While we're at it, let's liberate Jerusalem.
Yeah.
I'm paraphrasing, by the way. Shifting the focus to Jerusalem was really important because the Crusades were not primarily military operations. They were pilgrimages. Theologically, Christianity didn't have an idea of a holy war. Like, war might be just, but fighting wasn't something that got you into heaven.
So you have Augustine, who argues for what's called just war theory. I'm actually a just war theorist. Versus pacifism, which is the idea that like violence is never okay. I actually disagree with that. I am a just war theorist, although I'm as close to a pacifist as you can get without being one, right? Because I do believe that sometimes force is necessary to prevent evil, to prevent genocide, to prevent all sorts of bad outcomes. And so while war may be just, it should never be celebrated, right? And that is our culture's problem, is that we often celebrate violence and celebrate war when really we should just be looking at it as like this thing that sometimes we have to stomach in order to get the good outcome.
Pilgrimage to a holy shrine could help you out on that front, and Urban had the key insight to pitch the crusade as a pilgrimage with a touch of warring on the side. I do the same thing to my kid every night. I'm not feeding you dinner featuring animal crackers. I'm feeding you animal crackers featuring dinner. Oh, it's time.
Smart, right? Like this is good logic, right? We're going on a pilgrimage, and we'll retake Jerusalem while we're there.
Time for the open letter?
Pope Urban was smart.
An open letter to animal crackers. But first, let's see what's in the secret compartment today. Oh, it's animal crackers. Thanks, Stan. Hi there, animal crackers. It's me, John Green. Thanks for being delicious, but let me throw out a crazy idea here. Maybe foods that are already delicious do not need the added benefit of being pleasingly shaped. I mean, why can't I get my kid animal spinach or animal sweet potato or even animal cooked animal? I mean, we can put a man on Mars, but we can't make spinach shaped like elephants? What, Stan? We haven't put a man on Mars? Stupid world, always disappointing me. Best wishes, John Green. One last myth to dispel. The Crusades were not an example of early European colonization of the Middle East, even if they did create some Europeanish kingdoms there for a while. That's a much later post- and anti-colonialist view that comes, at least in part, from a Marxist reading of history.
I love that. I mean, John Green's going right at Karl Marx, saying that's a Marxist reading of history, that the Crusades are early colonial movements by Europe. No, the colonialism in Europe doesn't begin until after really the discovery of the New World by the Europeans in 1492. Then you start to get European colonialism in the New World, but also abroad, and that really lasts until today, right? Like imperialism is basically dead, right? Although it's here in terms of like economic imperialism and stuff like that, right? But I think it's important to note that, yeah, that's a poor reading of history to say it's like early European colonialism.
In the case of the Crusades, it was argued the knights who went adventuring in the Levant were the second and third sons of wealthy nobles who, because of European inheritance rules, had little to look forward to by staying in Europe and lots to gain in terms of plunder by going to the east. Cool theory, bro, but it's not true. First, most of the people who responded to the call to crusade weren't knights at all. They were poor people. And secondly,
Yeah, so what he's talking about is like in the Crusades, Pope Urban puts out this call for a crusade, and he promises everybody who participates will receive salvation. Basically, just blanket, you're going to get into heaven, which is a big deal. Right? And so there's a lot of people who made mistakes, or they felt like they were out of connection with the church. And it was like, oh, even if you were excommunicated from the church, you could come back in and crusade and regain your rightful place in heaven, which is a terrible theological development, terrible theology, but very compelling to people.
Most of the nobles who did go crusading were lords of estates, not their wastrel kids.
Yeah.
But more importantly, that analysis ignores religious motivations. We've approached religions as historical phenomena, thinking about how, for instance, the capricious environment of Mesopotamia led to a capricious cadre of Mesopotamian gods. But just as the world shapes religion, religion also shapes the world.
Absolutely.
And some modern historians might ignore religious motivations, but medieval crusaders sure as hell didn't. I mean, when people...
Yeah, you can't ignore the religious motivations that were behind the Crusades, right? Yes, were there some barons and lower nobility who were like, I'm the third son of my father, so I'm not going to inherit anything. But if I go crusade in Jerusalem, I might get a little like baronry or a duchy for myself out of it, right? Sure, there were those people, but that doesn't explain the vast majority of it.
People came up with that idiom. They clearly thought hell was for sure. To the Crusaders, they were taking up arms to protect Christ and his kingdom. And what better way to show your devotion to God than putting a cross on your sleeve, spending 5 to 6 times your annual income to outfit yourself and all your horses, and heading for the Holy Land?
There's a lot better ways. Feeding the poor, not killing people for no reason, right? But that's not how things always are, right? The Crusades are very outside of the teachings of Jesus, right? But it seems like the teachings of Jesus are not important at this point, right? The Crusaders are ignoring that in favor of the political outcomes that will come from the Crusades, the monetary outcomes, all those things, right? But this is not the teachings of Jesus.
So when these people cried out, God wills it, to explain their reasons for going, we should do them the favor of believing them.
Yeah, we should do them the favor of believing them about their religious motivations. God wills it. The Crusader cry was Latin. It was a Latin cry for God wills it. It was Deus vult. Deus vult, Deus meaning, God, and volt meaning wills it, right? So Deus vult was the cry of the Crusader, and it was this, they believed that this is what was God's will, was to retake Jerusalem.
The results of the First Crusade seemed to indicate that God had willed it.
Yeah, the First Crusade went well.
Preachers with names
That's
like Peter the Rabbit, Peter the Hermit. Stan, you're always making history less cool. Fine. Following preachers like Peter the Hermit, thousands of peasants and nobles alike volunteered for the First Crusade. It got off to kind of a rough start because pilgrims kept robbing those they'd encounter along the way.
Yeah.
Plus, there was no real leader, so there were constant rivalries between nobles about who could supply the most troops. Notable among the notables were Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond of Toronto, and Raymond of Toulouse. But despite the rivalries and the disorganization, the Crusaders were remarkably, some would say miraculously, successful. By the time they arrived in the Levant, they were fighting not against this...
Yeah, it's kind of nuts how disorganized they were. They took Jerusalem from the Turks. Like, they took Jerusalem back and set up the Kingdom of Jerusalem, which was a Crusader kingdom that lasted over 100 years. They were incredibly successful in the First Crusade out of nowhere. They had no organization. It's kind of like they said, it's like this miraculous thing. So you could kind of see how they believed that God was on their side, although that's not how it all ends in the end.
The Seljuk Turks, but against Fatimid Egyptians who had captured the Holy Land from the Seljuks, thereby making the Turks none too pleased with the Egyptians. At Antioch, the Crusaders reversed a seemingly hopeless situation when a peasant found the spear that had pierced Christ's side hidden under a church, thereby raising morale enough to win the day. And then they did the impossible. They took Jerusalem, securing it for Christendom and famously killing a lot of people in the Alaska mosque.
Yeah, so that's one of the worst things from the First Crusade is the massacre of the Muslim residents inside the mosque by the Crusaders, right? This is not Christianity. It's not Christianity, but it's important to know that this is a piece of our history. It's a piece of what's shaped our church and shaped our understandings of faith.
The Crusaders succeeded in part because the Turkish Muslims, who were Sunnis, did not step up to help the Egyptians, who were Shia. But that kind of complicated inter-Islamic rivalry gets in the way of the awesome narrative. The Christians just saw it as a miracle. So by 1100 CE, European nobles held both Antioch and Jerusalem as Latin Christian kingdoms. I say Latin to make the point that there were lots of Christians living in these cities before.
Yeah, Latin Christian kingdoms, meaning they are Latin church Christian kingdoms, not Greek Christian kingdoms, right? Eastern Orthodox Church, speaking Greek. These are Latin Christian kingdoms, meaning from the Latin-speaking West, which they're not really speaking Latin by now, but the church is definitely still using Latin. And Latin has kind of evolved into like Middle Italian and French and all that kind of stuff by this point. But yeah, it's important to note that these are Western Christian kingdoms.
Before the Crusaders arrived, they just weren't Catholic, they were Orthodox.
Right, they were Orthodox.
A point that will become relevant shortly. We're going to skip the Second Crusade because it bores me and move on to the Third Crusade because it's the famous one. Broadly speaking, the Third Crusade was a European response to the emergence of a new Islamic power, neither Turkish nor Abbasid. The Egyptian, although he was really a Kurd, Sultan al-Malik al-Nasser Salah el-Din Yusuf, better known to the West as Saladin. Saladin, having consolidated his power in Egypt, sought to expand by taking Damascus and eventually...
Saladin is the most famous of the Muslim rulers of the Crusader period.
Eventually, Jerusalem, which he did successfully because he was an amazing general.
He was
and
an
then
amazing
the loss
general.
of Jerusalem caused Pope Gregory VIII to call for a Third Crusade. Three of the most important...
If you've ever seen the movie Kingdom of Heaven with Orlando Bloom, it's a pretty, like, dramatized, because I think it's Ridley Scott, so it's like highly dramatized, but it's like a pretty good dramatic depiction of the fall of Jerusalem, the fall of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Crusader state, to Saladin.
Kings in Europe answered the call. Philip, cowardly schemer II of France, Richard, Lionheart I of England, and Frederick, I am going to drown anticlimactically on the journey while trying to bathe in a river, Barbarossa, of the not...
Okay, so you have a guy who's like, I'm going to go take the Holy Land, and then he's like taking a bath in a river and accidentally drowns. That's, I mean, it's like, it's tragic at the time, I'm sure, but it's like, it's just crazy to think about these stories where it's like, oh, you know, God wills it until I accidentally drown myself in a river, right?
Holy, not Roman, and not imperial Holy Roman Empire. Both Richard and Saladin were great generals.
Yeah, so not holy, we covered that in the last video. Not holy, not Roman, not empire, Holy Roman Empire. The first king to be crowned of the Holy Roman Empire, I'm pretty sure Charlemagne in the 9th century. And yeah, it becomes a political entity that lasts until, I think, like the 1800s. And it's not really like a centralized political entity. It's very interesting.
Generals who earned the respect of their troops. And while from the European perspective, the crusade was a failure because they didn't take Jerusalem, it did radically change crusading forever by making Egypt a target. Richard understood that his best chance to take Jerusalem involved first taking Egypt, but he couldn't convince any crusaders to join him because Egypt had a lot less religious value to Christians than Jerusalem. So Richard was forced to call off the crusade early, but if he had just hung around until Easter of 1192, he would have seen Saladin die. And then Richard probably could have fulfilled all his crusading dreams, but you know, then we wouldn't have needed the Fourth Crusade. Although crusading continued through the 14th century, mostly with an emphasis on North Africa and not the Holy Land, the Fourth Crusade is the last one we'll focus on because it was the crazy one. Let's go to the thought bubble. So a lot of people volunteered for the Fourth Crusade, more than 35,000, and the generals didn't want...
Huge army for the time. 35,000, huge army.
Want to march them all the way across Anatolia because they knew from experience that it was A, dangerous, and B, hot.
He said, this is where Crash Course falls short sometimes. He said they didn't want to march them across Anatolia. Anatolia is the old name for Turkey.
So they decided to go by boat, which necessitated the building of the largest naval fleet Europe had seen since the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
The Venetians built 500 ships, but then only 11,000 crusaders actually made it down to Venice because, like, oh, I meant to go, but I had a thing come up, etc. There wasn't enough money to pay for those boats, so the Venetians made the Crusaders a deal. Help us capture the rebellious city of Zara, and we'll ferry you to Anatolia. This was a smidge problematic.
This gets crazy. This story is crazy. Yeah, so they're like, they don't have the money to get there, but the Venetians are like, oh, if you take this city of Zara for us, Crusaders, we'll pay for you to get to Jerusalem, which they accept. And that's not good because he's going to describe, I'm pretty sure it's a Western Christian city.
Crusading-wise, because Zara was a Christian city, but the Crusaders agreed to help, resulting in the Pope excommunicating both them and the Venetians.
Yeah, so they help, they sack Zara, and the Pope literally excommunicates all of the guys in the crusade. Just like, you're all going to hell now. You're all excommunicated. It's crazy. And if I remember correctly, I want to say that the generals, this may be wrong, but I think I remember reading that the generals and the kings did not tell them that they had been excommunicated so that they would not be demotivated to continue the crusade. Yeah, it's crazy.
Then, after the Crusaders failed to take Zara and were still broke, a would-be Byzantine emperor named Alexius III promised the Crusaders that he would pay them if they helped him out, so the excommunicated Catholic Crusaders fought on behalf of the Orthodox Alexius, who soon became emperor in Constantinople.
Yeah.
But it took Alexius a while to come up with the money he'd promised the Crusaders, so they were waiting around in Constantinople, and then Alexius was suddenly dethroned by the awesomely named Murtzophlus, leaving the Crusaders stuck in Constantinople with no...
So now they're in Constantinople, which is modern-day Istanbul. They're at the seat of the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire. The Crusaders are Western Christians. Keeping this straight for everybody. The Crusaders are Western Latin Christians, Roman Catholics, right? And the Christianity in Byzantine Empire is Eastern Orthodox, right? So there's a difference there. Same faith, but some pretty big differences.
Money. Christian warriors couldn't very well sack the largest city in Christendom, could they? Well, it turns out they could, and
they did, and then they set up their own kingdom called the Latin Byzantine Kingdom, the Latin Kingdom. I think it lasted like 60 years.
Boy, did they. They took all the wealth they could find, killed and raped Christians as they went, stole the statues of horses that now adorn St. Mark's Cathedral in Venice, and retook exactly none of the Holy Land.
Yeah.
Thanks, Thought Bubble. So you'd think this disaster...
And then they set up a kingdom in the Byzantine Empire called the Latin Kingdom, and it lasted for like 60 years. Then it went back to the Byzantines, and then the Byzantine Empire lasted like another 150 years, and then it collapsed when the Seljuk Turks under Mehmet II conquered Constantinople in 1453 and turned it into his empire, and it's been in Muslim hands ever since.
Would discredit the whole notion of crusading, right? No. Instead, it legitimized the idea that crusading didn't have to be about pilgrimage, that any enemies of the Catholic Church were fair game. Also, the Fourth Crusade pretty much doomed the Byzantine Empire, which never really recovered. Constantinople, a shadow of its former self, was conquered by the Turks in 1453. So ultimately, the Crusades were a total failure at establishing Christian kingdoms in the Holy Land long term. And with the coming of the Ottomans, the region remained solidly Muslim, as it mostly is today.
Yeah, so you see the Ottoman Empire. I wish I could... so you see the Ottoman Empire up here. The Ottoman Empire basically remains the dominant power in the region until the Ottoman Empire falls at the end of the First World War. Only like 100 years ago. I think they folded the Ottoman Empire in like 1922, and it becomes the Republic of Turkey. So, yeah, pretty crazy how long the Ottoman Empire lasted.
And the Crusades didn't really open up lines of communication between the Christian and Muslim worlds because those lines of communication were already open. Plus, most historians now agree that the Crusades didn't bring Europe out of the Middle Ages by offering it contact with the superior intellectual accomplishments of the Islamic world. In fact, they were a tremendous drain on Europe's resources. For me, the Crusades matter because they remind us that the medieval world was fundamentally different from ours. The men and women who took up the cross believed in the sacrality of their work in a way that we often can't even conceive of today. And when we focus so much on the heroic narrative or the anti-imperialist narrative or all the political infighting, we can lose sight of what the Crusades must have meant to the Crusaders. How that journey from pilgrimage to holy war transformed their faith and their lives. And ultimately, that exercise in empathy is the coolest thing about studying history.
I cannot explain to you how happy it makes me he has that take, right? Now, everything has to be, like, yes, were the Crusades wrong? Yes, they were wrong. But it was a different people in a different time who really believed that they were doing right by Jesus. And that requires empathy from us to understand why they would have done what they did, even though we, of course, now know that it was wrong and teach it as wrong. Those two things can be true. Exercise in empathy is so important in the study of history because modern day ethics are very different from the ethics of the Middle Ages. Could not be more different.
Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.
That's it. Okay.
Crash Course is produced and directed by...
Excellent video. I really enjoy the way John Green does these. That one's pretty old, but it's a good video. So If you liked it, make sure you go like and subscribe to Crash Course. And if you like my commentary today, make sure you like and subscribe to the channel. It's literally the best thing you can do for a small growing channel like mine. But until next time, I'm Reverend Matt, and I'm the Connectionalist. I'll see you later. Bye-bye.